experimental psychology. Study session 1. The epistemology of the mind in the 17th and 18th centuries. Introduction. In the development of sciences, experimental psychology emerged from the fusion of two streams of thought: the philosopher's concern with the mind of man, in brackets, rather than his soul, and the psychologist's application of the techniques of experimentation and measurement. In this study session, you will therefore be exposed to the history of psychology as a science and its development on the knowledge of the mind. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss experimental psychology history as it relates to the epistemology of the mind. 2. Identify and discuss the contributions of specific people to experimental study of the mind. Perspectives on development of psychology. Bohr in 1950 believes that an experimental psychology should combine historical sophistication with his or her experiences in technical procedures. Otherwise, he or she will be unable to see present research in a proper perspective and evaluate the full significance of new concepts and techniques. Therefore, the gift of professional maturity comes only to a psychologist who knows the history of his or her science. Curiosity and wonder are the prime motivators of science. Thus, the workings of the mind have been of interest to man over the ages. However, the methods of science were not applied to the study of the human mind and behavior until 300 or 400 years after they found a solid place in physics. Epistemology of the mind as a science was greatly retarded by the Cartesian dualism, which states that though the mind and the body are separate entities operating according to the different principles, they will interact. In dualism, it is believed that the body is governed by physical laws like inanimate objects, while the mind is governed by such laws because it possesses free will. As such, scientific methods can be applied to discover mental laws. However, Descartes, 1596 to 1650, advanced the position that the body could affect the mind and the mind could affect the body. The application of scientific methods, which include physics and astronomy, starts with using animals because they were believed not to have souls and were treated as inanimate objects. Other philosophers such as Locke, Berkeley, Hartley, and Kant built on this foundation. Contributions to the development of experimental study of the mind. Contributions of John Locke to development of psychology. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, was born in Rigton, Somerset, England. He was brought up in a liberal Puritan environment and was educated at Christ Church, Oxford. His essay concerning human understanding, dated 1690, but actually published in 1689, like much of the rest of the 17th century philosophy, was a reaction to Cartesian mind, body interactionism, briefly examined above. Locke moved the discussion into the purely psychological realm of experience, contrasting the inner sense, in brackets, the mind's reflective experience of his own experience of things, with the outer sense, in brackets, the mind's experience of things. Locke, from his empiricist perspective, was the first to propose the epistemological questions of the limit of knowledge. employing a very general notion of idea that incorporated a disparate set of entities, among which modern psychologists would distinguish perceptions, mental images, and concepts. Locke concerned himself with both the certainty of our ideas, experimentally attained through reflection, or the inner sense and the truth of our ideas, insofar as they depend on the outer sense. After Locke, it would be possible to emphasize either the vivid character of the ideas transmitted by the outer sense or the intuitive certainty of the inner sense. Contributions of George Berkeley to development of psychology. George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, also made use of notions contained in Locke's essay. In the essay on human understanding, Locke had distinguished between primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities such as solidity or extension are completely inseparable from the bodies in which they inhere and are simply perceived by the senses. Secondary qualities are the powers inherent in objects to produce sensations in the perceiver, such as color, odor, or sound. The colors, odors, and sounds, however, do not themselves inhere in the objects. Berkeley's immaterialism was simply the notion of secondary qualities expanded to include primary qualities and taken out of objects and placed in God. George Berkeley was born at Kilkenny, Ireland, and educated at the Trinity College, Dublin. In 1709, he published his first book essay, Towards a New Theory of Vision. Although Berkeley did not explicitly discuss his immaterialism in the new theory, it was everywhere implicit in his views and combined with a proto-associational view of the importance of connections between ideas. It provided him with the basis for a theory of the perception of distance, which became a prototype for later associationist accounts. For Berkeley, distance is not immediately perceived by vision. Rather, when the mind has, by constant experience, found the different sensations corresponding to the different dispositions of the eyes to be attended each with a different degree of distance in the object, and there has grown an habitual or customary connection between those two sorts of ideas. Contributions of David Hartley to development of psychology. David Hartley, 1705 to 1757, was born at Londonderry, Halifax, England, and educated at Jesus College, Cambridge. In 1749, he published his two-volume Observations on Man. Hartley was the first to apply the association principle as a fundamental and exhaustive explanation of all experience and activity. Moreover, he joined his psychological theory with postulates about how the nervous system functions. According to Hartley, man's sensations were paralleled by vibrations or elemental particles in the nerves and brain. In relating the phenomena of sensation, ideation, and motion to the nervous system, he laid down the principles of psychological psychology, which Ferrer would later combine with the concept of cerebral localization. Hartley therefore made use of notions contained in Locke's essay. Contributions of Ethne Bonnot de Condillac to development of psychology. Condillac, 1715 to 1780, was born in Grenoble, educated in theology at St. Sulpice and at Sorbonne. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1740. Of the two sources of knowledge in Locke, sensations transmitted through the outer sense and reflection through the inner sense, Condillac focused exclusively on the former. His treatise, Des Sensations, published in 1754, was designed to show that external impressions through the outer senses, taken by themselves, can account for all the ideas and mental operations of man. Using the famous example of a statue, endowed with no other property than a single sense of smell, he attempted to derive attention, memory, judgment, imagination, the whole of mental life. Condillac views are clearly the most extreme form of tabula rasa perspective. Like all tabula rasa views, no matter how powerful the correlative principle of association, Condillac's extreme sensationalism runs afoul of the obvious fact of variation (in brackets, species differences, individual differences) in biological constitution. Contributions of Thomas Reid to epistemology of the mind. In direct contrast to Condillac, Thomas Reid (1710 to 1796) chose to emphasize Locke's inner sense, building on the simple notion of reflection to develop an elaborate theory of the institution and faculties of the human mind, given by its fundamental constitution. Reid was born near Aberdeen and educated at the Marischal College. His major work, An Inquiry into the Human Brain on the Principles of Common Sense, was published in 1764, the year in which he accepted appointment as Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Glasgow. In the Inquiry, Reid articulated the basic intuitional postulates of the common sense, philosophy on which the Scottish Faculty of Psychology was to be built. Intuitions are native tendencies to mental action. They are aspects of the fundamental constitution of the human mind, which regulate the conscious experience of all human beings from birth. Because intuitions require the presentation of appropriate objects in order to be called forth in mental action, the Scottish philosophy is realism. Intuitions do not project the mind into reality. They allow the mind access to it. Intuitionalism is a native of psychological process. It is also the methodological inquiry into the nature and existence of natively given principles of mind, which takes place by induction from observed facts in self-consciousness. It was this view, coupled with Reid's 1785 and 1788 later analysis of specific faculties, that dominated the 19th century academic mental philosophy in America. It was also indirectly from Reid that Gall obtained the original list of 27 powers of the mind that guided his attempt to map the localization of functions in the brain. Contributions of Immanuel Kant to epistemology of the mind. Kant, 1724 to 1804, was born, lived, and died at Königsberg in East Prussia. It is said that in the entire course of his life, he never traveled more than 40 miles from the place of his birth. The suggestion from Ribot that 18th century philosophy culminated in the work of Kant was probably not an unreasonable one. Although it might be fairer appraisal of Kant's influence to say that the philosophy of both 19th and 20th centuries followed Kant much as the earlier philosophy had followed Descartes. Kant's indirect influence on scientific psychology was therefore enormous. His direct contributions, although admittedly more circumscribed, were also of considerable importance. One of such contributions was Kant's defining the prerequisites that should be met for psychology to become an empirical science. Another contribution of Kant to psychology consists of a treatise, Anthropology in Pragmatische Hinsicht, published in 1798. Long ignored, probably in part because of his pronounced sympathy for his soon-to-be discredited physiognomy, the Anthropology is, nonetheless, a fascinating little book. In this work, Kant analyzes the nature of the cognitive powers, feelings of pleasure and displeasure, affects, passions, and character in the context of the possibility of an empirical science of conscious process. The Anthropology went through 2 editions during Kant's lifetime, and several later printings had helped to define the context within which not only Herbert and Fechner, but phenomenologically oriented psychologists such as Durkheim, Weber, and Muller worked to establish the science of conscious phenomena that Kant was unable to envision. Study session summary. In this study session, we focused on the historical background and contributions of different scholars in relation to epistemology of the mind. We noted that Locke moved the mind-body dichotomy into purely psychological realm of experience by contrasting the inner sense, in brackets, the mind's reflective experience of its own experience of things, and George Berkeley built on Locke's findings and proposed that there are connections between ideas from the mind, object, and distance. This provided him with the basis for a theory of the perception of distance, which became a prototype for later associationist accounts. He also learned that Hartley was the first to apply the association principle as a fundamental and exhaustive explanation of all experience and activity. Condillac, who was born in Grenoble, focused on Locke's sensations transmitted through reflection through the inner sense, the former. End of study session 1. Thank you for listening.